Iran believed it controlled one of the most powerful choke points on Earth. For decades, it sat at the edge of the Strait of Hormuz and built an entire national strategy around a single idea. Control the passage, control the world's energy. Control the world's energy, and you control the decisions of nations. If the strait closes, oil stops. If oil stops, industries slow down. If industries slow down, economies weaken. If economies weaken, governments panic. And when governments panic, they negotiate. That was the logic. That was the leverage. That was the weapon Iran believed it had perfected over 40 years. And for a long time, it worked perfectly. Not because Iran used it, but because it didn't have to. The threat alone was enough. The idea of closing the Strait of Hormuz was more powerful than actually doing it. No country wanted to test that reality. No global power wanted to risk triggering a disruption that could shake the entire world economy, because nearly 20% of global oil supply moves through that narrow corridor. That is not just a statistic. That is the backbone of global energy flow. So the system stayed stable. The balance held. The threat remained theoretical until 2026. Because in 2026, everything changed. The theory was no longer enough. The situation escalated, and for the first time, the possibility of closure became real. And when that moment came, something unexpected happened. The world did not freeze, it adapted. And that single shift changed everything. When tensions escalated and the Strait of Hormuz was effectively disrupted, the immediate impact was massive. Shipping traffic slowed down dramatically. Oil tankers hesitated to enter the region. Insurance premiums skyrocketed. Many routes became too risky to operate. Oil prices surged rapidly. Markets reacted instantly. Fear spread across global financial systems. Governments rushed into emergency meetings. Energy security became the top priority overnight. And one question dominated global discussions. Can the world function without the Strait of Hormuz? At first, the answer seemed obvious. No, because infrastructure takes years to build. Because global supply chains are deeply connected. Because geography cannot be changed overnight. But that assumption did not last long. Because the system did not collapse. It adjusted. It moved. It started searching for alternatives. And one country moved faster than anyone expected. The United Arab Emirates. Instead of reacting with military escalation, the UAE took a completely different approach. It responded with infrastructure. It activated a pipeline, not a new pipeline, not something built in response to the crisis, but something that had been quietly developed years earlier. A pipeline designed specifically for this kind of scenario. This pipeline connects Abu Dhabi's inland oil fields directly to the port of Fujairah, and Fujairah is located on the Gulf of Oman, outside the Strait of Hormuz, outside the choke point. That location is critical, because it allows oil to bypass the strait completely. And the moment the crisis escalated, the UAE pushed the system to its limits. Oil that would normally flow through Hormuz was redirected. Instead of moving through the Persian Gulf, it moved eastward, straight to open waters, straight to international markets. The pipeline carries around 1.5 to 1.8 million barrels per day. That is not enough to replace Hormuz entirely, but it is enough to change the equation. Because for the first time, a major energy exporter proved something important. Hormuz is not the only route, and once that idea becomes reality, everything changes. Because power in geopolitics is not just about control, it is about perception. And the perception of absolute control had just been broken, but the UAE was not alone in this shift. Saudi Arabia moved as well. Its east-west pipeline became a critical part of the global response. This pipeline stretches across the country from the Persian Gulf to the Red Sea, and during the crisis, its capacity usage increased dramatically. Millions of barrels per day were redirected. Oil that would have passed through Hormuz was sent across land instead. Together, these pipelines created something new. Not a replacement system, but a backup system. A parallel route. Enough to reduce panic. Enough to stabilize supply. Enough to show that the system can adapt under pressure. And adaptation is the most dangerous thing for any choke point strategy. Because choke points depend on dependency. They depend on the idea that there is no alternative. The moment an alternative appears, even a partial one, the entire strategy starts to weaken. And that is exactly what happened. Iran's leverage was not destroyed overnight, but it was challenged. And once leverage is challenged, it begins to erode. But this is where the situation becomes more complex. Because pipelines are not perfect solutions. They have limits. They have capacity constraints. They cannot carry the same volume as global shipping routes. And more importantly, they are fixed targets. Unlike ships that move across oceans, pipelines stay in one place. They can be located, they can be tracked, they can be targeted. That makes them vulnerable. And that vulnerability quickly became part of the equation. Energy infrastructure came under pressure. Facilities faced disruptions. Operations slowed down in key areas. And critics raised an important argument. Replacing one vulnerable system with another does not eliminate risk. It simply changes its form. And that argument is valid. Because even with pipelines operating at full capacity, The global system remained under stress. Supply stayed tight, prices remained volatile, uncertainty continued to dominate market behavior. So the Strait of Hormuz did not become irrelevant overnight. It still mattered. It still carried weight. But something deeper had changed, the perception of dependence. Before this crisis, Hormuz was seen as irreplaceable, as a single point of failure that could not be bypassed. Now it was seen differently. Now it was one route among several. Still important, but no longer absolute. And that shift in perception changes behavior. Because geopolitics is not just about physical control, it is about psychological leverage. If countries believe they have no choice, they act cautiously. They avoid confrontation. They maintain balance. But if they believe alternatives exist, even imperfect ones, everything changes. They take stronger positions. They form new alliances. They invest in new infrastructure. And that is exactly what started happening. Energy importers began diversifying their supply routes. New agreements were signed. Emergency investments were approved. Projects that had been delayed for years suddenly became urgent because the world had learned something important. Dependence is a risk, and reducing that risk became the new priority. Countries that once stayed neutral started shifting their stance. Regional dynamics began to change, and the system started evolving in real time. And that evolution is the real story here. Because even if the Strait of Hormuz fully reopens, the system will not go back to what it was before. The assumption that one narrow waterway can control global energy has been broken. And once that assumption is broken, it cannot be easily restored. The long-term impact of this shift could reshape the entire region. More pipelines will be built. More alternative routes will be developed. More redundancy will be added to the system. And that means less reliance on any single choke point. And less reliance means less leverage. Iran's strategy was built on geography, on positioning, on the belief that location alone could guarantee power. But geography can be bypassed. Infrastructure can expand. Technology can evolve. And when enough pressure is applied, the world adapts faster than expected. That is exactly what happened. The attempt to demonstrate control triggered a response that accelerated independence. The move that was supposed to strengthen leverage may have actually weakened it, and that is where the real strategic shift begins, because once the world starts building around you, your position changes. Slowly at first, then all at once. And Iran is now facing that reality. A reality where its most powerful advantage is no longer unquestioned. A reality where the world is no longer waiting. It is moving. It is building. It is adapting. And once adaptation begins, it does not stop. It accelerates. But what makes this shift even more significant is what it reveals about the limits of power built on geography. Because for decades, Iran's entire strategy depended on one assumption, that the world had no choice. That assumption is now under pressure. And once an assumption like that starts to crack, it does not stop at the surface. It spreads deeper into every layer of the system. Because this is not just about oil flows. This is about decision-making at the highest levels of global power. When the Strait of Hormuz was disrupted, countries were forced to confront a reality they had avoided for decades. What happens if the choke point fails? And more importantly, what happens if it can be bypassed? That question is now shaping long-term strategy. Energy importing nations are no longer thinking in terms of stability. They are thinking in terms of resilience, because stability can be broken. But resilience can absorb shocks. And that shift in thinking is already visible. Countries like China and India, which depend heavily on Gulf energy supplies, are accelerating diversification plans. They are expanding storage capacity. They are securing alternative suppliers. They are investing in infrastructure that reduces reliance on any single route, because the lesson is clear. Dependence creates vulnerability, and vulnerability invites disruption. At the same time, global energy companies are adjusting their strategies. Shipping routes are being reassessed, risk calculations are being updated, insurance models are being rewritten, because the cost of disruption has now been experienced in real time, and once that cost is understood, behavior changes permanently. But there is another layer to this story, a layer that goes beyond economics, a layer that involves politics and alliances, because the response to the crisis was not just technical, it was political. Countries that once maintained careful neutrality are now being pulled into clearer positions. The UAE's decision to activate its bypass pipeline was not just an economic move, it was a strategic signal. A signal that it is willing to operate independently of Iran's influence. And that signal did not go unnoticed. Regional dynamics began to shift almost immediately. Alliances started strengthening. Security cooperation increased. Joint planning discussions intensified. Because the risk was no longer theoretical. It was real. And real risks demand real responses. Saudi Arabia's actions reinforced this shift. By increasing the use of its east-west pipeline, it demonstrated that large-scale redirection is possible. Not perfect, not complete, but possible. And possibility is enough to change strategic thinking. Because once something is proven possible, it becomes a foundation for future expansion. And that is exactly what is happening now. Discussions are already underway about expanding pipeline capacity. New routes are being evaluated. Long-term infrastructure projects are being accelerated. Because the goal is no longer just efficiency. The goal is redundancy. Multiple routes, multiple options, multiple layers of security, and every new layer reduces dependence on the Strait of Hormuz. Every new project weakens its strategic importance. But this transition is not simple. It comes with costs. Building pipelines is expensive. Maintaining them is complex. Protecting them requires constant vigilance. And even then, they remain vulnerable, because fixed infrastructure cannot move. And in a region with ongoing tensions, that matters. Attacks on energy infrastructure highlight this risk clearly. Facilities can be targeted. Supply can be disrupted. Repairs can take time. And during that time, markets react. Prices move. Confidence drops. Uncertainty spreads. So while pipelines provide alternatives, they also introduce new challenges. And managing those challenges requires coordination. Coordination between governments. Coordination between companies. Coordination between allies. Because no single actor can manage this alone. And that is leading to another important shift: increased international cooperation. Countries that once operated independently are now working together more closely. Information sharing is increasing. Joint security measures are being discussed. Collective responses are being planned, because the threat is shared. And shared threats create shared interests. This is how geopolitical landscapes evolve, not through single events, but through reactions to those events. And the reaction to the Hormuz disruption is still unfolding, but its direction is already clear. Less dependence, more diversification, greater resilience. That shift is not temporary, it is structural. Because once systems start adapting, they do not return to their previous state. They evolve, they expand, they reinforce the changes that kept them alive. And that is exactly what is happening now. The Strait of Hormuz is still there. The ships will eventually return, the traffic will recover, but the illusion is gone. The belief that one narrow passage can control the entire global energy system has been broken. And in geopolitics, perception is power. When perception changes, power follows. Iran did not just test its strategy, it exposed its limits. Because a strategy built on control only works as long as that control remains unquestioned. The moment it is challenged, the system begins searching for a way out. And once that search begins, it does not stop. It accelerates. It spreads across industries, across countries, across alliances. Every new pipeline, every new agreement, every new route is part of that acceleration, is part of that shift away from dependence. And that is the real consequence of this moment. Not just disruption, but transformation. Because the world is no longer reacting. It is preparing. Preparing for a future where no single choke point can hold it hostage. Preparing for a system that is more flexible, more distributed, more resilient. And in that system, leverage changes, power shifts, and strategies that once seemed unbreakable start to fade. Iran built its advantage over decades, carefully, patiently, strategically. But in one moment, by trying to prove that advantage, it triggered the process that could eventually erase it. And that is the paradox of power. The more you try to prove it, the more you risk losing it. The Strait of Hormuz is not gone, but its dominance is no longer absolute. Its control is no longer guaranteed, and its role in global energy is no longer untouchable. The world has seen another way. And once the world sees another way, it never forgets it. This is not the end of the story. This is the beginning of a new phase, a phase where control is replaced by competition, where dependence is replaced by diversification, and where every crisis becomes a catalyst for change. Because in the end, the most powerful force in geopolitics is not control, it is adaptation.